Welcome to Untangling Traditions. Today we'll be speaking with Professor Dagmar Wujastyk, the Principal Investigator of AYURYOG, Entangled Histories of Yoga, Ayurveda and Alchemy in South Asia. Dagmar is a Sanskritist who specializes in pre-modern literature of Indian medicine, Ayurveda, yoga and alchemy, Rasa Shastra. Welcome, Professor. So firstly, what is the AyurYog Project?
The AyurYog Project is a 5-year research project that is funded by the ERC, that's the European Research Council, and the project is based at the University of Vienna, the University of Alberta in Canada, and also at Inform in London. The project examines how yoga, Ayurveda, so classical Indian medicine, and Rasa Shastra, which is Indian alchemy and iatrochemistry or chemical medicine, historically connect. And it queries what these connections mean for our understanding of these disciplines in their modern and globalized forms today. We've been asking questions like, did yogis in the medieval period practice medicine? And if so, was it for treating themselves or for treating others? What were the modalities? Did they use medicines and therapeutic principles from the well-established Ayurvedic tradition, or did they formulate their own ways of treating ailments? Were yogis perhaps even competitors to Ayurvedic physicians? Was the medicine developed in Rasa Shastra milieus radically different from the kinds of medicines in Ayurvedic ones, or did alchemists depend on Ayurvedic principles in the formulation of their medicines and elixirs? Did they share an understanding of the properties of substances, or can we discern different ideas about the nature of materials? Was the medicines used by yogis influenced by alchemical thought? Are there health practices shared by all three disciplines? What does the concept of health mean to practitioners of the different bodies of knowledge? And do ideas developed in the past carry forward to present practices? Or do we see major changes to approaches? So we've been working on these and related questions. We are currently a team of 4 researchers. So I'm the principal investigator, the manager of the project, and I am based both at Vienna University and at the University of Alberta. As Jackie said, I am an Indologist and I look at the Sanskrit sources for Indian medicine and Rasa Shastra, and I write about what these genres of literature tell us about the connections between Ayurveda and Rasa Shastra. Currently, I am working on a source book of Indian alchemy. And together with Andrew Mason, I'm also working on a reconstruction of alchemical procedures described in a 10th century alchemical work. And then on the team, there's also Dr. Christelle Barrois, who is also a Sanskritist and who is working at the University of Vienna. And her work has been dedicated to the connections between yoga and medicine. And she has particularly focused on an important early text on yoga that may be the first systematic exposition on health-related aspects of a certain kind of yoga practice. Another postdoctoral researcher of our team, Dr. Suzanne Newcomb, who is a social historian and religious studies scholar and who is based at Inform in London, has been working on the connections between yoga, Ayurveda and Rasa Shastra in the modern period, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries. And finally, our postdoctoral researcher, Dr. Patricia Southoff, has been working with me on the source book of Indian alchemy. And in the beginning of the project, we also had with us Dr. Jason Birch, who was specifically looking at medicine and the kinds of practices that developed on yoga in the medieval period. And of course, there are many other people who have been involved in the project and who continue to contribute to the project, such as yourself.
It's fascinating to hear how wide-ranging the not only the literature, but also the material and the types of questions you're asking of this material. So did your research develop in any unexpected ways?
It did, and that was largely due with a change in the people involved. So Jason Birch, whom I mentioned earlier, with his specific expertise on Hatha Yoga or medieval yoga literature, moving over to the Hatha Yoga Project meant that Christelle Barrois came on board. And she brought with her a different perspective and new ideas of how to approach the question of entanglement between yoga and medicine. We hadn't anticipated work on the Dharmaputrika. It wasn't, so the Sanskrit work that she has been working on, it wasn't on the list of works that we were going to examine. And then in the last 2 years, I was able to hire another postdoc, Patricia Saltoff, and this enabled me to start on the source book of Indian alchemy. Again, that was not part of the initial plan at all. But while working on alchemical literature and trying to find the connections with medicine, I came to understand that some basic secondary literature on Indian alchemy was really needed, as this is an area of Indian knowledge that very few people are familiar with. Even though Rasa Shastra, Indian alchemy, has been an influential discipline in many ways. Suzanne Newcomb has contributed an important resource for the project. She had the idea to make an interactive timeline of yoga and Ayurveda, initially for the 20th century, to document the different settings in which yoga and Ayurveda were presented as complementary or braided sciences. We are now working on an expanded timeline to integrate Jason's work on medicine and Hatha Yoga literature or medieval yoga literature, and also Christelle's findings on the Dharmaputrika and some other elements. And again, this was not part of the research proposal, but I think it's been a very important and useful tool.
Considering your findings in these entangled histories, those of yoga, Ayurveda, and alchemy, what do you consider to be your most important findings?
This is such a weirdly tricky question to answer because, of course, every time one makes a big sweeping general statement, there's always bound to be a counterexample. But, and a lot of our findings are very detailed. But if I think of broad patterns, I think that I can state that while the idea of yoga practice, so specifically breathing and postural practices, as a health intervention is documented in many texts on yoga early on, the connection of health-related practice in yoga to the learned discipline, so the literary discipline of Ayurveda, as represented in Sanskrit Ayurvedic literature, is less certain and only clearly evident in fairly late literature on yoga. We're talking 17th, 18th century onwards. Conversely, Ayurvedic treatises contain nothing on yogic practice with a very few exceptions. So it is very clear from our studies that learned Ayurvedic physicians and writers did not consider yoga as part of their medical repertoire. So to probably oversimplify, yogis mostly do not seem to have practiced medicine according to the formal discipline of Ayurveda, and Ayurvedic physicians did not prescribe a yoga practice of any kind to their patients. Nevertheless, there was a lot of medicine. It's a formative part of yogic practice to have health interventions, but these health interventions were not necessarily Ayurvedic in nature. The idea of Ayurveda and yoga as sister sciences, as braided sciences, seems to have developed in the latter half of the 20th century and has now in recent years become a more established idea, both in global forms of yoga and in institutionalized forms of Ayurveda and yoga in India. And this is something that you can trace in our interactive timeline. And when it comes to Ayurveda and Rasa Shastra, I can now state with confidence that the connection between the two disciplines is already present in even the earliest of the alchemical works, though somewhat hidden. So common wisdom was that early alchemical texts have no medicine, and later ones only have medicine. So and then in between ones have both medicine and alchemy. But actually my research has shown that Rasa Shastra has modeled itself deeply on Ayurveda, using, for example, the structure of Ayurvedic vitalization therapy, or Rasayana, in its own procedure of elixir regimen, also called Rasayana. And there are many other commonalities, for example, the way that Rasa Shastra defines itself as a Shastra, that is a learned discipline, giving guidelines on who should ideally practice it and how this should be done. So there we see that again, Rasa Shastra has modeled itself very strongly on Ayurveda.
Absolutely extraordinary history to think that this idea of the sister sciences of yoga and Ayurveda being fairly recent, although they may share some terminology in terms of the body and so forth. And then the finding that you have, which is this very deep and long connection between Ayurveda and alchemy itself. So it is your first project as a principal investigator, this 5-year ERC project. So do you feel that the project has achieved its aims?
Yes, and sometimes we have exceeded our initial aims, but there's always more to do. I do think we have been stronger in some areas than in others. We have this triad of disciplines or practices that we're looking at and examining how they interact. And we've been doing that in pairs. So, what's the connection between yoga and Ayurveda, or how do Ayurveda and Rasa Shastra connect? The relationship between Rasa Shastra and yoga has received a little less attention than the other two, though we do have a few results on that, and we also know where to look for more answers next. We did find one area of commonality between all three disciplines, namely in the practice of Rasayana or Kaya Kalpa. So these are therapies or regimens aimed at rejuvenation, revitalization, and the prolongation of lifespan, among other things. And one of our major publications is dedicated to that subject. The project was planned to survey a really long time period from the 10th century to the present, and therefore we always knew that we wouldn't be able to cover everything. Rather, we hope to give a solid basis for further research, and I do think we have done that.
If you were to have the 5 years again, what would you do differently? And then also, what advice would you give to other scholars, particularly young scholars, who are embarking on challenging roles such as a principal investigator of a 5-year research project?
I mean, hindsight is always 2020. You never know what avenues will turn out to be dead ends, what manuscripts you will be able to get hold of, what texts turn out to be particularly interesting or not. But you have to do the work to say this text tells us nothing about the research question. So I think that even if I did it all or some of it differently, different challenges would arise. The project would not be better, just different. One thing I would now do differently when writing the research proposal is that I would give more space to the artistic representation and the experiential dimension of the project. I've tried to do that a little bit, but I would give more emphasis to it. So this is things like, designing the website, making documentary films, planning exhibitions, using music for our documentaries, for example, thinking about the images used in presentations and in social media, and about objects that we can present to audiences. So everything that is about giving an experience that involves all the senses, auditory, visual, tactile. We are meant to convey our research to a wider public as well as to our peers, to other scholars. And I believe that art can deliver a very direct access to complex contents. And one should never underestimate the emotional aspect of scholarship. So what sparks our interests? What gives us joy? So in my next proposal, I will make sure to emphasize this aspect of the research project and to involve artists as well as scholars.
How would you build upon the research that you've completed to date, and what would be the next stage or the emerging areas of research in your field?
Yeah, so as I said, there's still quite a lot to do. I think this generally is an area that can be developed much further. Thinking about the connections between yoga and medicine, I think one of the things we found, especially Jason Burton, who's looking at medieval yoga literature and the kinds of medicine or health interventions described there, is that we should perhaps look to tantric sources as an influence on the kinds of medicine that developed in yogic milieux. So I think that would be a worthwhile avenue to look a bit more deeply into it. Also into Buddhist and maybe Buddhist tantric influences on this area of yoga. So that's something that I think further research should be developed on that. And then for alchemy, I think there's a real need for more translation of works and also editions of the works. We've started on the translations with the source book of alchemy, but that's just chapters of works. I think translations of whole works would be very useful to open the field to more wide scrutiny. So perhaps a bit more like what the Hatha Yoga project is doing at present, to just give us a bit more of a solid basis for further work and research. So these are the two areas that I would like to see developed.
Yes, this alchemy reader will be really groundbreaking for the field, not only identifying the texts and making them available for graduates and undergraduates, I guess, that are interested in pursuing this area. So you may see a burgeoning of interest in these particular area of study. So my last question for you is, what direction are you heading in personally now that the AyurYog project is coming to an end? Do you have any new goals in particular in mind?
I think, first of all, there will be some tying up of loose ends, as it were, though we hope to complete as much work as possible in the next months. But after that, for myself, I would like to work on how the modern practice of Rasa Shastra connects with its literary past. So modern Rasa Shastra is a subsidiary science to Ayurveda. And I would like to examine Rasa Shastra not just as medical knowledge, but also as part of South Asian intangible cultural heritage based on certain knowledge traditions. I would like to investigate the making of medicines and what it entails in terms of who are the knowledge holders? What are the limitations to that knowledge? How does a recipe from a 10th century alchemical work translate into a modern pill prescribed by a doctor? And what are issues of production in terms of sourcing materials in times of extreme ecological change, with many plants now being endangered or of limited availability? So generally, also what about the sourcing of medicinal minerals? Mercury, the central substance in alchemical works, is now considered very toxic, and its industrial production has been more or less halted. So what happens to all this intricate knowledge about processing such a material and other materials when the material no longer is available or is considered a substance that should not be used and that cannot be administered? So what happens to this cultural heritage of a body of knowledge? So this is something that I personally would like to look in a bit more deeply in the coming years.
Yes, this is again an area which I think is really topical, because we have the interest, not only a global interest in more medicines more broadly, but also indigenous medicines and the establishment of things like Ayush, who are attempting to bring back medicines perhaps from the past and then creating these medicines. So it'll be really interesting to see how much of that you can trace. It's been an absolute pleasure, Dagmar. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again on other topics of entangled histories. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie.